Boa tarde. Todos me ouvem? Sim. Então, a gente está se encontrando aqui para mais um Teaços. Muito obrigada pela presença tão entusiasmada de vocês e frequente, né? Hoje a gente vai ter a imensa alegria de receber o David Henderson. David Henderson é PhD, conferencista do Departamento de Estudos Psicossociais e Psicanalíticos da Universidade de Essex. Ele é membro da Associação Jungiana da Inglaterra e trabalha como terapeuta em Londres há 37 anos. Ele morou em Angola, no Congo e nos Estados Unidos. O título da palestra dele hoje é Amplificações Deleuzianas da Psicologia Analítica. A palavra é sua, David. Muito obrigada pela tua presença.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation, and I hope that I can say something that's of interest to you. You got the picture, right? So I'm coming here as a psychotherapist. That's my work. If I know anything about anything, it's a little bit about psychotherapy. So I am not a philosopher, so I cannot claim to be making any sort of real serious intervention or comment on Deleuze or Deleuzian philosophy. So like most psychotherapists, I'm a magpie. So I looked that up as pássaro pega. I don't know if you say that in Brazil. It's the kind of bird that goes around and picks up things and takes it to its nest. So psychotherapists are like that. So you get a little bit of Jung, a little bit of Bion, a little bit of Winnicott, some neuroscience, some rock and roll, and you put them in your nest in your consulting room, and you enjoy looking at them when you're there. So psychotherapists are like that. Psychotherapists are not mostly very kind of classical, strict sorts of thinkers. So, and Jung was like that. Jung picked up things here and there that would help him to express himself. So there's a lot of criticism, for example, that Jung's Kant or Jung's Levi-Bruhl are not really proper. That he misinterpreted things, he put the emphasis in the wrong place. So this is part of being a psychotherapist, is that we borrow lots of things and we try to use them to help us make sense of our work and our thoughts. So that is sort of my justification for having the temerity to use something from Deleuze. So if Deleuze was here, I would apologize to Deleuze. I'm sorry. I'm using your ideas in a very one-sided and incomplete way. But I'm a psychotherapist, so what can you do? So there are a lot of ideas in Deleuze and Guattari that have a very strong feeling or resonance with Jung. So if you read Deleuze and Guattari, it feels very familiar. It feels what they're talking about, even though the language is different, it has a very familiar kind of sense to it. And unfortunately, we know that they read Jung, but we don't really know how deeply the influence was or how thorough it was. I would love to be able to visit an archive and see the volumes of Jung that they actually read, to see what they underlined and what they wrote in the margins and so on, to get a sense of how much did they actually dig into it? But there's so much in Deleuze and Guattari that just leaps off the page as a kind of Jungian sort of sensibility. So if I say it's a Deleuzian amplification of analytical psychology, that's really a hermeneutic circle, because already Deleuze and Guattari somehow have some kind of Jungian influence. So I want to, I don't know how much time I'm going to have, but there's three real ideas from Deleuze that I want to use or get a hold of today. So one is to do with time. One is to do with the body without organs. And one is to do with becoming. So I'm particularly interested, there are three problems in psychotherapy that are of particular interest to me. So as we go along, I will do some screen shares. So I hope that can be kind of seamless. Okay, so I'm interested in these three problems. The gap between the archetype and the archetypal image. So this is a kind of problem of theory. The passivity of the analyst. So this is a problem of practice. The operation of transference, which is a problem of process. So these are kind of three areas that I have a sort of ongoing interest in. Now, these are also, I think, in different ways, you can think about these as related to time, different aspects of time. Now, other people have tried to think in sort of broad categories about time and analysis and psychology and so on. So one is Neumann. So Neumann had this kind of structure of the creation myth and the original unity, and then the hero myth and the separation of the systems, and then the transformation myth, then centroversion and the stages of life. So these are kind of, these are all related, you could say, in some way to time. And Kant had a similar three sort of stage thing. He had the synthesis of apprehension, which he related to sensibility, the synthesis of reproduction, which he related to understanding, and the synthesis of recognition, which he related to reason. So I'm not really going to go into Neumann and Kant, but to focus here on Deleuze. Deleuze has what he calls the three syntheses of time. So the first synthesis of time he associates with habit and the present. The second synthesis of time is associated with memory and the past. And the third synthesis of time is related to empty form of time and the eternal recurrence. So each of these is a very complex idea, and I'm not proposing today to go into all his arguments about the notion of the synthesis of time. What I want to do is draw out this idea of the three syntheses and sort of begin to use it to think about analytical psychology. So I'm associating the first synthesis with the collective unconscious and archetypes and the idea of the present. The second synthesis, the archetypal image, I'm associating with collective memory, collective consciousness, cultural complexes, and the past. And then the third synthesis, the human, I'm associating with the future, with infinity, and what I call the historical subject. So this is my basic template here. The archetype is related to the present. the archetypal image is related to the past, and the historical subject is related to the future. Now, the thing is that in the kind of Deleuzian world, each of these is a different kind of time. So each of those, the archetype as present, the archetypal image as past, the historical subject as related to the future. From a Deleuzian point of view, you would argue that the archetype is a particular type of time. The archetypal image is a particular type of time. The historical subject is a particular type of time. And I'm going to use some work with a client and some dreams that this person had over about 3 years to kind of illustrate that. So what I'm doing is I'm attempting to clarify the relationship between the archetypal image, and the historical subject as they present themselves in clinical analytic process. So I propose that each of these instantiates a different order of time, and that each time implies a distinct ethical demand. So the demand made by the archetype time, the demand made by archetypal image time, the demand made by the historical subject time, each of those makes a different demand on the therapist or the analyst. In other words, you have to respond in a different way. If somebody is really predominantly in one of those kinds of time, then you have to respond to that. And the person who's in that sort of time has particular demands, pressures, moral kind of demands on them. And you can't expect somebody in one to be responsible for the time of another situation. So I'm associating the archetype with the present, the archetypal image with the past, the historical subject with the future. And I'm drawing on the 3 syntheses of time and Deleuze's discussion of Spinoza's ethics. He talks about Spinoza has 3 ethics, and you can relate those to the different kinds of time. So all of these, what interests me is in analytical psychology, how do we think about change? So there's a huge amount of literature and time spent in supervision and so on, trying to create a map of how things move from the archetype to the archetypal image to the ego, right? So the assumption there is that there is a seamless process and that you can track it, and that if you push it in a certain way, then you can make it move forward and so on. So what I'm saying is that I'm disagreeing with that, and I'm arguing in favor of a lack of continuity. I'm arguing in favor of discontinuity. You cannot assume there is a continuity from archetype to archetypal image, from archetypal image to the historical subject. They are each distinct things. So, so this is Williams. So Williams says there are different times according to the singularities of the individual processes at work. We must avoid any general spatial representation of time as something pre-existent that things can be placed on or in. There is no general line of time and no space-time continuum. In other words, we're used to thinking of time is sort of there as a container, and something is put into time at some place along that continuum. So this is a different point of view. It's saying there is no continuum, that you can't really understand properly the nature of these different kinds of time if you insist that they must be part of some continuum. So Deleuze said about Spinoza's ethics that the ethics can appear to be a long continuous movement that goes in an almost straight line with an incomparable power and serenity, passing again and again through definitions, axioms, postulates, propositions, demonstrations, corollaries, and scholia, carrying everything along in a grandiose course. But he says if you look at the text more carefully, there's three elements which are not only contents but forms of existence. Three kinds of knowledge which are also modes of existence and expression. So what I'm suggesting is that archetypes are a mode of existence, right? And they have their own coherence and their own they are a type of time. Archetypal images are a different kind of time. They also have their own coherence. And then the historical subject, again, is in a different kind of time and has its own coherence. So the archetype is what I'm calling the present. So it's a kind of eternal present that nothing fundamentally changes. So Spinoza takes from Hume the idea of habit. So the archetype is a kind of habit. It's just, Jung says it is a typical situation, right? So it is just a kind of habitual repetition in the present moment of some possibility. Possibly a possibility that we can't really even say much about. Then somehow, for some reason, then archetypal images appear. Now, I'm relating that to the past, to history. So archetypal imageries have a history, and they have movement, and they're collective, but they're alive. Something's moving, something's changing, something's developing. So we can talk about the history of some figure or some image and how it develops and the impact it has. So the past has come alive in the archetypal image in a way that it isn't in the archetype. Then the historical subject, I'm saying, is oriented to the future, is oriented to death. The historical subject has the time for the historical subject is, it's history, but it is, my history will end, not too distant future, and that'll be that, right? So that is my orientation in time and to time is quite different than the orientation of an archetypal image or the orientation of an archetype. I do find it really interesting that, Jung built his house on the lake, not his home, but the house on the lake where he would go. And he built it in stages. And near the end of his life, he built the top floor and he said, that's my ego. Right? So he didn't arrive at his ego until quite late in life. I think that's really interesting. So, because often, we think, oh, well, you start with the ego and you dismantle it and then you get connected to the archetypes and then you're going along and so on. So I really want to turn that on its head a bit and say the proper development of the ego is something that happens quite late in life. The proper development of the historical subject is something that demands a lot of individuation, a lot of experience. So it is not something that is given very easily, early in life. And the thing about the historical subject, which resonates, I think, with what Deleuze talks about, is that it's singular. In individuation, we discover our singularity. We are, each of us, a singular speck on a whole web of things, right? And part of the challenge of individuation, part of the challenge of being a historical subject, is to take responsibility for that little bit of the web where we are. So the archetypal image and the historical subject are, it is argued, distinct modes of existence and expression. And there is an emptiness that separates them. So they're separate. And between them, there's an emptiness, there's a gap. And the analyst must attend to the leaps, the lacuna, and the cuts and the gaps between these singularities, rather than relying on a notion of a continuous, uninterrupted individuation process. I think it's essential that differentiation is the engine of individuation, right? So it's difference, and this really resonates with Deleuze, that Deleuze is insistent that what matters is difference, and that difference is what creates things, creates the new. He's not interested in replicating or representing or getting back to some original or something. He's interested in how do we arrive at something new, something really new. We don't do it by repetition or replication or, this represents this and so on. I think there's an interesting resonance here, like in Africa, the fetish, the little statue, there is, what the statue looks like tells you nothing about the spirit that inhabits it. So you cannot read the character of the spirit from the image that's there. So I think the same, an archetypal image is like a kind of a fetish image or an icon or something. We can't really read the character of the archetype from the picture, right? From the image. We need different sensibility to try to get a feel for or an intuition of some kind of archetypal energy, but we can't just say, oh, the king archetype therefore equals this or that or whatever. An image of a king, that doesn't really tell you about the spirit that's occupying that image. So I want to speak now about a therapy and about some dreams that were happening over the period of about 3 years, maybe more. And in the first part of this therapy, the person would always be saying, nothing is happening. Right? Nothing's happening. And I would have to agree, nothing important was happening. The person would come to their sessions 2 or 3 times a week, had, various things they were doing in the world, but essentially nothing was happening. So this went on for really quite a long time, and the person was wondering, oh, well, maybe this isn't for me or whatever. Then one day, they came in with a dream. So the dream is of a giant fish. Half of its enormous body is underwater, and half is sticking out of the sea like a boat. There's a person sitting on its tail, tiny in comparison. I'm seeing this from a distance, but I'm at the same time the person riding the fish. There is also an image of my father in a boat. He is standing and holding an oar. Both him and the boat look so small, insignificant, side by side to the fish. I was very excited by this dream. I thought, oh, here we go. But, the person was not really very interested in the dream. They didn't leap on it. I mean, I leapt on it. I thought, oh, this is, now we're cooking. I mean, because the fish obviously was very powerful, full of energy, and it's an archetypal image, right? So it is moving us from the kind of the flat present, eternal present of the archetype to the beginnings of entering into the time of the archetypal image. Because the fish obviously has a huge history and a huge amount of significance, whereas up to now, nothing had been happening. Now we've got a big fish. Right? So this was, I thought, really significant. And I took a lot of hope from this. I thought, okay, now something's constellated, now something's moving, now there's a lot of energy in the space. And this is also somebody who would never have dreams, right? Didn't dream really at all. And so this dream seemed to come out of nowhere. Then there was quite a long gap where, again, not a lot was happening, but every once in a while I would refer to the fish with the hope that, that the person would be moved or excited in some way. Then one day they came in with this dream. My mom sends me to what used to be my primary school. The school is on a hill. I go on foot, taking the road I used to take as a child. I start walking uphill and the road changes. It's full of obstacles. Big rocks and fallen trees are blocking my way forward. I manage to get past several obstacles and find myself in a clearing, but staring at a precipice. There is a way around, but it means trespassing. I negotiate my passage with a representative of the Chinese community that owns the land. Continuing my journey, I must pass through people's back gardens, which I know is intrusive. I see a snake which becomes a creature made of a snake, a hen, and a man. I feed it, the snake part, some dry grass, and I'm allowed to proceed. When I arrive to the school, I report to the receptionist. She is surprised that I came by that road. There is a much easier way to get to the school, she says. Everyone takes the other road, and it's easy to get here by car. So, again, I was excited. And I showed this person a picture of Mercurius from the collected works. And I said, was it anything like this? And they immediately said, that's it. That's it. So this sudden appearance, when we were in the time of the archetypal image of Mercurius, set in motion a huge amount of change in the person's life. So I think this dream happened in the spring, maybe I don't know, April or something, March, April. And by October, the person's life was completely changed. So a huge amount of energy was released by that dream. But we were still in the time zone of the archetypal image. So there were other dreams. And so this person she made a drawing of this, a painting of it, and she went away on holiday, walking in the mountains, and took this along to think about. And she did quite a lot of reading about Mercurius. So she was really trying to digest the content of the dream. So then there were there was some more what I would call archetypal image dreams. So a big white snake is guarding an entrance to a restaurant, and I want to get in. The shape of its head and its pose resembles that of a cobra. With its body upright, the snake is looking straight at me, facing me. It's very angry, but it isn't poisonous. An image of a tree. Snakes are falling from its branches like fruit. So this is a continuation of being in the time of the archetypal image, because all of these images have a lot of history, a lot of energy, a lot of symbolic resonance, and so on. The thing about the snakes that struck me is, this thing that she was really taken with the idea that it's angry but not poisonous. It's angry but not poisonous. So this was somebody who was quite afraid of anger, that anger would be somehow poisoning or damaging or whatever. So here we're meeting something that's angry but it won't kill you. Then we got to a kind of transition so the Mercurius and the snakes and all of that were this kind of eruption. But very quickly, then this put the person in a particular frame of mind, with the images and the energy and so on. But then quickly, the consciousness focused, and there was sort of what I would call a transition to the identity of the historical subject, the time zone of the historical subject. And the person got busy and started sorting their life out. So there were things that had been in place in this person's life for more than 10 years that had been a kind of unbearable, suffering for them. And within a few months, everything was sorted. So from the state of like being several years where nothing's happening, within a few months, everything was put in place, and the person had reorganized their life and was living really a different kind of life, and living with a different sense of who they were. So one aspect of this is what I would call the historical subject of taking responsibility for oneself as a historical subject, understanding one's place in history. So there were some dreams around this period that sort of give expression of this transition. My ex-boyfriend introduces me to his new girlfriend. She seems nice, but I say something cold to her. I then apologize to my ex, saying, I'm leaving, as I feel too bitter to stay. Me and some other people must catch a ferry. I have 1 hour to pack before our car is set to leave. We need to leave by noon. Provided that there will be no traffic issues, we will have 5 hours to get to the ferry. I'm stressed out. I don't know if I can be ready in such a short time. I'm trying to think and organize myself, but I'm constantly interrupted by people who want something from me and are unaware that I'm leaving. I need to go. I'm in a hurry. Before leaving, I must find a yellow notebook and give it back to one of my clients. She is looking for it. She must not know that it was me who took it. I'm in charge of an upcoming school event. I'm in a classroom on my own, unable to organize a meeting to discuss the imminent celebration. People have expressed their interest in the event. Kids have drawn pictures wanting to be part of it. Everything is available for the occasion, and yet I don't know how to make it happen, how to pull it all together. So this is the transition to the problems of a historical subject, how to pull it together, how to make it happen, how to have a life in the world. So from a position of being extremely passive, I mean, somebody who used to just sit for hours really and stare into space, and only do things when, it was sort of required by the situation. Now the person was full of plans and, like the dream says, wanting to make things happen, but not really quite knowing how to go about it. So that was sort of the existential part of this time in her life. Right, so there was another dream I wanted to mention. Which is a much more recent dream, which the person calls the Blue Phoenix dream. I move into a flat that belongs to my brother. It's only temporary, perhaps to do with the COVID-19 situation. I'm to share it with another person, I think a woman. What first seemed to be a tiny one-bedroom flat turns out to be much bigger as I begin to look around. Wandering around the place, I'm astonished how spacious it is. It's shabby and the furniture is old and it needs painting, but it's airy and has a lot of potential. I investigate the kitchen and wonder how it is that the furniture is the same as my parents'. Then I find myself in the bedroom. My flatmate is already asleep. It's summer and I feel hot, so I open a big sash window and step outside onto the window ledge. I sit there for a while and then look to my right. There on the same level, probably on the neighbor's balcony, I see 3 different kinds of birds. They look extraordinary, unlike any birds I have seen before. One of them reminds me of something, perhaps a beige high-heeled shoe. The most striking of them is much bigger than the other birds. It's extraordinarily beautiful with lots of wonderful deep blue feathers. What a marvelous sight. I think that at some point it looks at me. It has a stern expression. Perhaps all birds do. Looking at the birds, I almost fall off the window ledge. Barely catching myself, I pull myself up and go back inside. Reflecting on my dream in the morning, it occurs to me the blue bird was a phoenix. I am also wondering whether it is somehow related to my Mercurius. So this is a much more recent dream, and I suppose one interesting thing about it, it seems to be located in the time of the historical subject, in the flat. And she's discovering that, you know, there's quite a lot of space there. There's lots of positive things about being a historical subject. But then just outside, she finds this amazing bird. So she seems to be in touch with both the, you know, the everyday business of having a home and having a flat, and the sort of marvel of having a phoenix living right outside your window. That there's scope in this dream for both. But as we commented, it's better not to fall off the balcony. She needs to, you know, make sure she's properly grounded and doesn't get carried away with these beautiful birds. So Deleuze says some things which say something about the transition here. I would say the transition from the archetypal image, that kind of time, to the time of the historical subject. One steps outside what's been thought before, once one ventures outside what's familiar and reassuring. Once one has to invent new concepts for unknown lands. Then method and moral systems break down and thinking becomes a perilous act, a violence whose first victim is oneself. Thinking is always experiencing, experimenting. And what we experiment with is what's coming into being, what's new, what's taking shape. So for me, this is relates to this transition to being a historical subject, that the historical subject is in a very precarious place. It's a dangerous place to be a historical subject. And it's very difficult to maintain that equilibrium, because it's easy to fall back into the world of the archetypal image and get swept along. So that could be swept along in some kind of political nonsense, or some kind of inflated religious ideas or whatever. So to really maintain the stance of being one of these really peculiar historical subjects is very demanding. So I think what Jung says here has a resonance here. The imaginatio, as the alchemists understand it, is in truth a key that opens the door to the secret of the opus. The place or the medium of realization is neither mind nor matter, but that intermediate realm of subtle reality which can be adequately only expressed by the symbol. The symbol is neither abstract nor concrete, neither rational nor irrational, neither real nor unreal. So I think I would go so far as to say that the historical subject is a kind of symbolic expression, that we are each a kind of a symbol. In other words, we each express something that cannot be expressed in any other way except by our own peculiar nature, our own peculiar being. The connection there with the imaginatio is interesting, that to be a historical subject is an act of imagination. You need to have your imagination needs to be able to engage with the historical circumstances of the world and of yourself, and to find a perspective and a place to live from that is well, it doesn't have the comforts of being too dependent on the archetypal image or the archetype. So like Jung's kind of, top floor of his house, it is something you can only arrive at later in life to be able to have that balance, to have that refinement of mind and imagination. So I was thinking here of going on to talk about another problem, but maybe it's time to just see what questions and discussions we have before I launch into something else.
David, a gente costuma fazer um debate no final da exposição. Acho que se você tiver mais coisa para falar, você pode falar, depois a gente encerra com o debate. O que você acha?
If you're happy for me to continue, I can. So what I've been talking about now is the problem of time, but I wanted to talk now about a different problem, which is related to, in a way, the confrontation with the unconscious and individuation. So Deleuze has an idea which he calls a body without organs. So he says that his idea is that an organism is defined and determined by something outside, and he's interested, though, in a different sort of body that is not defined and constrained by external definitions and external parameters. And he calls that the body without organs. So Land describes the body without organs. And what I want to do is suggest that Deleuze's idea, Deleuze and Guattari, the idea of the body without organs, is a way of trying to think about the collective unconscious. So Land says the unconscious is not an aspirational unity, but an operative swarm. A population of pre-individual and pre-personal singularities, a pure, dispersed, and anarchic multiplicity without unity or totality. The absence of primordial or privileged relations is the body without organs. Social organization blocks off the body without organs, substituting a territorial, despotic, or capitalistic socios as an apparent principle of production, separating desire from what it can do. So there's a challenge here to a view of the unconscious in analytical psychology, which is too organized and too comforting and too settled. And a view of wholeness that is somehow that it's a whole and it's just finding it where everything fits and then everything's okay. So what I like about this is it's really emphasizing, in a way, the chaotic, what he says, the anarchic multiplicity of the unconscious, that things are happening. So Deleuze is more interested in how are new things created than he is in where do things fit together. How is it that new things appear? New states of consciousness, new forms of society, and so on. How can we think about that moment where something new appears? I mean, Bion says something interesting that, when something new happens, we don't know where it came from. It appears, and we can't say where it came from. So that's very similar to, Winnicott's spontaneous gesture. And I think, Jung is along those lines where he says, when someone tells me a dream, I say, I have no idea what this means. And where he says that the worst thing an analyst can do is to know beforehand. So as a therapist, how do we orient ourselves to be in a kind of genuine form of not knowing, in a genuine form of receptivity? So this is Deleuze-Guattari. Where psychoanalysis says stop, find yourself again, we should say instead, let's go further still. We haven't found our body without organs yet. We haven't sufficiently dismantled ourselves. Substitute forgetting for anamnesis, experimentation for interpretation. Find your body without organs. Find out how to make it. It's a question of life and death, youth and old age, sadness and joy. It is where everything is played out. So I'm thinking of this in relation to Jung's confrontation with the unconscious, that Jung had to go through, a process of allowing things to happen. Jung says, we must allow things to happen in the unconscious. We need to, and he says, listening to Eckhart, we need to let go of ourselves. We need to let go of ourselves. So this is very similar to what Deleuze and Guattari are talking about. Not to kind of hold on to our boundaries in too tight a way so that we can't be affected and moved by things we don't understand. So they've said elsewhere, so what does it mean to disarticulate, to cease to be an organism? How can we convey how easy it is and the extent to which we do it every day? And how necessary caution is in the art of dosages, since overdose is a danger. You don't do it with a sledgehammer, you use a very fine file. You invent self-destructions that have nothing to do with the death drive. Dismantling the organism has never meant killing yourself, but rather opening the body to connections that presuppose entire assemblage, circuit, conjunctions, levels, and thresholds, passages, and distribution of intensity, and territories and deterritorializations measured with the craft of a surveyor. And how can we unhook ourselves from the points of subjectification that secure us, nail us down to a dominant reality. So this is part of the whole discussion about the body without organs, which is allowing a kind of anarchic, disorganized mode of being or thinking or feeling to take apart our attitudes, to take apart our assumptions. And he's interesting. He says that dismantling the organism has never meant killing yourself. So in this discussion, there is stuff about addicts and so on, how addicts try to do it through their addiction, but that's really not a very skillful way of dismantling yourself. That is a kind of suicide. So what does he mean by dismantling the self with a very fine file? I mean, to some degree, you could say that's what goes on in analysis, that the structures, the complexes we bring to analysis are very slowly, usually, loosened up, and things come apart a bit. And this allows new forms of energy and new forms of communication. That's part of what Deleuze and Guattari are pointing it to. So just to begin to close here, this is also part of a discussion related to individuation. So individuation, becoming is a big idea in Deleuze. He says becoming is a rhizome, not a classificatory or genealogical tree. Becoming is certainly not imitating or identifying with something. Neither is it regressing or progressing. Neither is it corresponding, establishing corresponding relations. Neither is it producing affiliation or producing through filiation. Becoming is a verb with a consistency all its own. It does not reduce to or lead back to appearing, being, equaling, or producing. So when he says becoming, he says, we need to become other. So it's about becoming other than what we have been. So this echoes with differentiation. We need to become different from ourselves in order to individuate. We have to take the little opportunities to recognize how we are different from ourselves. So we often think of that in terms of the other and the unconscious and so on, but it happens in every phase of being, doesn't it? In relation, in how you think, how you feel, and so on. You're always sort of recognizing that you're other than who you think you are. So the subject in process, that is, as becoming, is always placed between two multiplicities, yet one term does not become the other. The becoming is something between the two, this something called by Deleuze a pure affect. Therefore, becoming does not mean becoming the other, but becoming other. The non-place in between acts as a gap, a differentiator, introducing an element of discontinuity in the otherwise continuous process of becoming and allowing the difference to actively intervene. So this is Deleuze, he wants difference to actively intervene. And this has an echo with, one of my problems I presented at the beginning about the transference, isn't it? That Freud said that you give the person the opportunity to free associate, and then they change the subject or they fall silent or something happens to interrupt the flow of being. And he says that's where you'll find the transference. So here, they seem to be pointing to something actively intervening. There's some kind of energy or perspective. Something is disrupting this kind of seamless, ongoing notion of individuation or of wholeness, or of psyche even. And it seems to me that that's really important because that's about being alive. Right? Deleuze is about being alive. How can we understand what it is to be alive? And to be alive is to be alive to these differences. So it isn't just about finding or constructing some kind of solution that seems to make us feel safe or secure, or that we fit into some larger scheme. That Deleuze, I think, is really interested in how do we think about, how do we allow this kind of the living moment as we go along, which he identifies with difference, allowing difference to actively intervene. So I think that is a kind of good problem for analytical psychology to think about. How do we put our focus on being alive rather than on being whole, if you like. It's more important to be alive than to be whole. It's more important to experience these differences and discontinuities and interruptions than it is to know how it all fits together. I think that'll do me for now. Yeah.
Muito obrigada, David, pela sua explanação clara de um tema tão difícil e tão árido de se ler, na minha opinião. A gente costuma emendar isso no debate, mas fica à vontade se você quiser alguns minutinhos de intervalo para a gente prosseguir. Fica a seu critério.
Okay.
Então a gente começa aqui o debate, então a gente faz como sempre a gente faz, o nome no chat, eu vou chamar o nome, e aí vocês fazem as perguntas, tá bom? Eu fiquei com uma curiosidade, David, vou começar com essa minha curiosidade. Quando você falou dos sonhos do seu paciente, eu fiquei pensando no tema da amplificação dos sonhos. Fiquei imaginando se você usa isso, se você se utiliza dessa ferramenta na tua prática. Porque ele teve sonhos muito simbólicos, né? Falar de cobra, de peixe. Eu rapidamente pensei no Aion, né? Que traz muito desses símbolos. Eu estou num estudo aí mais profundo do Aion atualmente. E você, na hora que você ouviu o sonho, você disse que você ficou feliz, né? Viu coisas boas lá no sonho, então eu também já imagino que você fez os seus links aí. E nada veio do paciente naquele momento. Então eu queria saber um pouco isso de você. Você se utiliza disso? Porque também isso é muito oposto ao que o Hillman traz do fique com a imagem, né? Na psicologia arquetípica. O fique com a imagem não pressupõe amplificação. Então eu queria saber qual é a sua opinião sobre isso.
Well, I felt in this case what was important was the energy, right? I mean, looking over them, for this event, I could see there's so many things that could have been picked up and so on, but I didn't think that it would really be in the service of that person. It would be my interest, but I think, Jung says that, what matters is the person who has the illness, not the illness, right? So what did this person need? This person needed for me to listen and for me to respond to the change of energy in her life and in her psyche, rather than get too bogged down in, oh, snakes are this and this is this and let's amplify this and so on. Really, what the person needed was to change their life, right? They needed to get out of the life they were in and get a new life. That was what was needed. They didn't need to spend a lot of time mulling over these things or amplifying them even. I mean, that's an interesting thing and perhaps necessary thing perhaps for me to do. I mean, I think it's important that I could, Winnicott says the mother responds to the spontaneous gesture, right? So you could say these dreams were like spontaneous gestures of this person. So I did respond to them, but I didn't respond to them in the sense of, let's look at the content of the dream. So I didn't focus really on the content other than, I did mention the fish and Mercurius, obviously I mentioned that and so on. But I felt the more important thing was that the person's system was getting energized and mobilized and beginning to have a focus to go out into life. So I agree there's lots of really interesting things that in the dreams that you could pick up and so on, but I didn't think it was really what she was interested in, or wouldn't have been very pertinent at that time, right? I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe if we went back over them now, it would be different, maybe. But I think, as you can see, the dreams have changed a lot. The person is not having these archetypal image dreams. The dreams are much more about everyday things, and I think that's good. That's good for this person to be in the everyday and to be making a life, for herself. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I think there's room for different ways.
Sim. Obrigada. O Marcos tem perguntas para fazer? Microfone, Marcos.
Olá, David. Obrigado pela sua fala. Muito instigante, muito provocadora. Eu tenho duas questões, vou fazer uma primeiro, ao longo do debate eu vou fazer outra. Eu estava lendo esse livro, da qual você é editor, e que você escreveu um texto, e você traz uma ideia muito interessante, que é a ideia da totalidade não como um princípio, mas a totalidade como um efeito. A produção de um efeito. E você associando a ideia de totalidade com individuação, você fala de uma possibilidade de comunicação entre os elementos da psique sem subordiná-los a um princípio de identidade. Essa ideia dessa comunicação sem estar subordinada a um princípio de identidade é o que a gente poderia chamar do corpo sem órgãos. Equivaleria a essa ideia, e nesse sentido a individuação poderia ser pensada como uma ética da criação de um corpo sem órgãos, uma comunicação entre os elementos para fora de um princípio de identidade que os regule?
Yes, I think, but I think I don't know, in that chapter there's a bit about something from Charles Dickens, who describes that this man is dying in one of his novels. This man is dying, and all these people are gathered round, like, oh, what's going on here? So the man himself, nobody liked him, right? But as the man was there dying, he was fascinating. In other words, life itself is fascinating. Being alive, even if the person is, a terrible person, is a fascinating thing, event. So I think that individuation needs to be a kind of dialectic between a kind of ego consciousness, right? Particular ego, and this kind of collective unconscious or body without organs or something, well, it's very hard to conceptualize, but there is a dialectic process in individuation, I think, between the ego and the collective unconscious, or the ego and infinity, or whatever. I'm not sure that answers your question or even addresses it. Do you want to come back to me, say that again, see if I can be more precise?
Eu estava pensando exatamente a partir do que você havia escrito, de que essa comunicação entre as várias dimensões da psique, do ego com várias partes da psique ou do inconsciente, mas sem que elas estejam dominadas por um princípio único de identidade, se isso poderia se equivaler à ideia do corpo sem órgãos.
I think so, yes, but I think that a principle of identity is inevitable. So I think we all have some principle of identity in our heads, even if we tell ourselves that we shouldn't or whatever. So, but I think that whatever principle of identity we have is always in the context of this kind of anarchic maelstrom that Land is talking about. I mean, someday I'd like to write a paper about, people write about the arche, right? The arche, the kind of origin, the original, but I'd like to write about the anarche, right? The anarche is what interests me, that there isn't an origin, there isn't a principle. Right?
Você tinha mais uma pergunta, Marcos?
Obrigado, David.
Já fez as duas? Tá. Então, a próxima pergunta é da Patrícia da Mata e depois o Maurício Santos.
Oi, vocês me ouvem?
Sim.
David, eu já gostei muito quando você começou se apresentando como a partir desse olhar do psicoterapeuta, que eu acho que eu me identifico com isso. Eu gosto muito de estudar Deleuze, mas eu não consigo ainda. Eu estou tentando trazer diálogos com Jung e muitas vezes fico com medo, assim, porque eu acho que tem alguns limites, principalmente quando a gente recebe as críticas que eles fazem à psicanálise, né, já desde o antiédipo. E que eu acho que muitas vezes a gente pode recair as questões que eles criticam, né, do ponto de vista da psicologia, e até por isso que eles propõem a esquizoanálise, né, assim, como outra forma de lidar com o desejo, enfim, com o inconsciente. E eu gosto dessa ideia do inconsciente maquínico, que é esse inconsciente que produz. E às vezes eu sentia que era uma noção que ia na contramão dessa noção junguiana, que é o inconsciente que busca, né? Na profundidade, no passado, nos arquétipos. E você fez uma conexão que para mim foi até de grande alívio, assim, de dar uma nova abertura. Então, eu já gostei muito desse ponto. E uma coisa interessante, assim, que naquela série de entrevistas do abecedário do Deleuze, como junguiana, um trecho que me deixa muito contente é justamente quando ele está falando a letra D, de desejo, de devir, ou desejo, ele está falando de desejo no contexto, e quando ele vai falar do Freud, ele fala justamente da relação do Freud com Jung, e ele fala assim, o Jung estava falando para o Freud que eram vários ossos naquele sonho dele. E o Freud teimava em querer afirmar que era um osso, que era o osso, e relacionar com a questão do falo, né? E eu acho que ali ele faz uma referência a Jung também, que dá para a gente pincelar e trazer para debate. E recentemente eu descobri o conceito de individuação mesmo, essa palavra individuação no Deleuze, quando ele faz uma referência ao Simondon, que na verdade é um conceito do Simondon, que se chama individuação. E eu queria perguntar se você conhece esse conceito, se ele tem aproximações com o conceito de individuação do Jung, porque pelo que eu entendi, essa individuação nesse sentido mesmo, de se fazer indivíduo, desse indivíduo que se faz nessa produção maquínica, né? Nos agenciamentos dos devires. E eu acho que você já falou um pouco disso, mas eu não sei se tem uma relação com esse conceito mesmo, com o nome individuação. E aí, se você puder explorar um pouquinho mais isso, eu agradeço. Acho que é isso.
Yeah, I don't know what I can say. I mean, I know Simondon uses that. I don't really know enough about him to say anything useful. I mean, of course, it is an idea that goes back, hundreds of years. So there's, in all these philosophies and religions, there is some principle of individuation, which is, conceptualized and practiced in different kinds of ways. Jung has his own way of thinking about it. I don't know I can't really say anything about Simondon. I mean, is there something about his approach that you find particularly interesting? Is there something about how Simondon talks about it that you think is interesting or important?
Na verdade, a pergunta é se você, nas suas referências, você encontra no Deleuze esse conceito de individuação, que eu vi em um texto, em um artigo que relaciona Simondon com Deleuze. É um texto de filosofia. Até posso compartilhar o link aqui, mas eu queria saber se o Deleuze usa esse conceito para a gente fazer mais diálogo, né? Para ser possível esse diálogo maior com o conceito do Jung.
Well, I think lots of what Deleuze talks about is applicable to the idea of individuation. So when he's talking about becoming, or when even talking about the body without organs, or all these different things, I think can be applied to the idea, Jung's idea of individuation. So I think they do help us to amplify the concept of individuation in a Jungian framework. That's really my interest, is to how to take ideas from Deleuze or other people and apply them to basic ideas in analytical psychology so that we can think more broadly about individuation. So if we think about, even in the last thing I put up on the screen, what he's saying about becoming, and about difference actively intervening, right? So that's an act of individuation. So that's like differentiation. Jung says differentiation is the primary, method, tool, action that promotes individuation, is differentiation. So Deleuze is just full of ways of thinking about differentiation, ways of thinking about how do we get to something that's new. So if you're thinking of individuation merely in the sense of getting back to the self and some kind of archetypal orientation, then Deleuze is not happy, because he's saying that's not about the new, right? That's just kind of old, that's an old thing. So, but if you're thinking of individuation as something about moving forward, about discovering new forms of consciousness, new ways of relating, new kinds of art and all this, if you think that's individuation, then I think Deleuze has a lot to say about it. And almost everything he says is about how to recognize the new, how to not get caught in the old, how to not get caught in repetitions, how to, in a way, seize hold of the opportunities of the new situation. So I think Deleuze has a lot about individuation, but not maybe in a kind of, just a straightforward way,
Obrigada, Patrícia. Maurício, vamos lá?
Posso falar, Lu?
Pode falar, sua vez.
Então tá. Bom, boa tarde. Quero agradecer ao Tiassos por nos dar essa oportunidade de ouvir o professor David Henderson, né? E quero dizer que esse tema me é muito caro. Faz alguns anos que eu estudo Deleuze, além de Jung e tal. E acho que, inclusive, demorou um pouco, assim. Acho que nos últimos 20 anos têm surgido esses trabalhos, né? Pensando esses dois campos aí de forma, digamos, simultânea, né? Eu citaria o trabalho do professor Christian Kerslake, que é impressionante, é muito interessante, do Paul Bishop também, e agora o seu livro, né, professor? Que o Marcos Quintais já nos mostrou aqui, né? Então, eu queria fazer duas perguntas, uma delas de mais clínica e outra um pouquinho mais teórica, né? E vou fazer rapidamente isso para não ocupar demais o tempo, né? Com relação ao encontro teórico da teoria, de vários aspectos da teoria junguiana com a teoria do Deleuze e Guattari, me parece que é um encontro muito frutífero e por muitas vezes é mais fácil do que parece, inclusive. As coisas, de uma forma impressionante, encaixam, né? Como encaixaram na sua fala aqui, né, professor, e no seu livro também. Contudo, quando a gente vai para o campo clínico, me parece às vezes um pouco mais difícil, né? E aqui me refiro à esquizoanálise, né? O Anti-Édipo e a Esquizoanálise, que é um livro muito intenso, pós-68, e onde há essa proposta, digamos, da constituição de um tipo de prática clínica, né? Mesmo que difusa, mesmo que não seja exatamente a proposta da constituição de uma escola e tal, né? Bem, entre tantas outras coisas que Deleuze e Guattari falam, eles têm muita desconfiança com as noções de metáfora, de símbolo, de imagem, né? E de qualquer mediação do inconsciente com relação ao campo social, né? Então, para eles o inconsciente investe diretamente os sócios do campo social e, em princípio, não são necessárias ou desejáveis essas mediações pela metáfora, pela imagem, pelo símbolo, né? Eles buscam o que eles chamam que eles nomeiam literalidade, uma literalidade, né? Então, essa é a minha primeira pergunta, né? Quer dizer, como de alguma forma, se é que isso é possível, compatibilizar essa clínica junguiana e mesmo pós-junguiana, que depende tanto do símbolo, da imagem, né, e da metáfora, com esta proposta, digamos, esquizoanalítica que clama por literalidade. E mesmo os conceitos deleuzianos que parecem metáforas, a gente sabe que a intenção de Deleuze é que eles sejam, de alguma forma, literais, nesse sentido de literalidade. Quando ele fala de máquina de guerra, por exemplo, ou máquina abstrata, ou rizoma, a ideia é que isso não seja exatamente uma metáfora, né? Mas que seja algo que tenha um certo caráter de imanência, né? Essa é a primeira pergunta. A segunda acho que é mais tranquila. O senhor acha correto ou interessante, ou pelo menos coerente, chamar o inconsciente junguiano de um campo de multiplicidade virtual, pegando aí a leitura que Deleuze faz de Bergson? O inconsciente junguiano pode ser chamado de um campo virtual de multiplicidades, ou um campo de virtualidade, um campo de multiplicidades virtuais ou um campo virtual de multiplicidades? É isso, obrigado. Desculpa me estender um pouquinho.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of what Deleuze and Guattari say about psychoanalysis is really the target is Lacan and Freud. So I don't know of many places where they are targeting Jung in the same sort of way. So you could say that when this is just what I'm thinking in the moment, you could say that when Jung says that he's an empiricist and he says that he's a phenomenologist, that he is taking the psyche to be real, right? Is that a similar kind of statement, that he's saying that these psychic forces, images, are not metaphors, right? They are actually powers. They are energies. They are actual structures. So we talk about symbols and metaphors and so on, but Jung seems to be, one way of thinking about Jung is that he's quite materialistic in a way, that he's treating the psyche as a kind of fact. The psyche is a kind of machine, if you like. It is. So I don't think that, when Jung says, for example, that the complex, you're possessed by a complex, that's not a metaphor. Or when the psychotic person is possessed by the archetype of the self and thinks they are Christ, that's not a metaphor. That is a kind of, I think, for Jung, a sort of fact. And he's saying, I'm speaking about these facts in the best way I can, right? But I think he's not treating them he's not treating them as a kind of symbol in Freud's sense. He's not saying this is a symbol of something else. Jung's not saying this is a symbol of something else. He's saying this is the energy, the image, the potency of this thing, whatever it is, and it is real. So I don't know if that would point to some kind of sympathy with between Deleuze, Guattari, and Jung. But I think that just what I said at the beginning. I think a lot of what they say about therapy and analysis and so on is aimed at Lacan and Freud. I don't know what you think of that.
Quer repetir sua segunda pergunta, Maurício? Tá respondido?
What Mauricio thought about what I said? Did he think I was?
Sim.
O que acha?
Primeiro eu gostaria de agradecer pelo Jung materialista, né, professor? Porque eu acho que é uma via bem interessante filosoficamente para abordar o Jung quando ele justamente trata desses fenômenos. E acho que o que o senhor falou agora vem na direção desse entendimento. E claro que é um materialismo complexo, digamos assim, né? Ou especulativo, como tem se falado na filosofia contemporânea, que inclui uma concepção de Bergson, né? Que inclui a ideia de virtual e atual, né? Eu acho que isso o Christian Kerslake explica muito bem no livro dele e é de uma grande ajuda para entender isso, né? No livro do Sonu Chandasani, ele conta lá que Jung e Bergson nunca se encontraram, porém parece que nutriam alguma admiração pelos trabalhos um do outro, né? Não sei se é isso mesmo, mas de toda forma, gostei muito da sua resposta, muito obrigado. Eu acho que é por aí mesmo, eu acho que é possível sim, de alguma forma, fazer essas clínicas conversarem, e acho que as críticas de Deleuze e Guattari, realmente o objeto principal era, como o senhor mesmo disse, Lacan e Freud, eles estavam ocupados com isso naquela época, né? E menos ocupados com Jung, infelizmente, poderiam ter dedicado algumas páginas a mais e mais diretamente, né? Muito obrigado.
Lucy Regis.
Boa tarde, gostei muito da sua fala, David. Tem um texto de Deleuze que chama O que dizem as crianças. E é uma concepção cartográfica de deslocamentos, trajetos e devires. Como podemos ativar mais essa concepção na clínica, como crianças que se desvencilham de pontos que prendem e, como você falou, desmantelando-se também como terapeutas?
Don't quite understand the question. What are you saying about the children?
Eu vou repetir. Tem um texto de Deleuze, não sei se você conhece, que chama assim, O que dizem as crianças? Que ele fala muito dessa concepção cartográfica de trajetos, de afetos, dos devires, né? E você trouxe muito essa ideia do desmantelar-se do paciente. E aqui eu te faço a pergunta sobre os terapeutas, que já vêm com muitos conceitos prontos, mas que eles também podem se desmantelar nesse processo clínico, para não serem, né, estarem nesse lugar de suposto saber. Então, é mais ou menos isso.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I'm very interested in the apophatic. So that's my PhD was about apophatic elements in psychoanalysis in Jung. So I think that so the apophatic is not knowing. So how does the therapist not know, right? And so that there are actually, there's a long discussion in philosophy and theology about not knowing. And there are many ways of thinking about not knowing in philosophy and in theology that can be very helpful to psychotherapists. The psychotherapists mostly don't have any idea about how not to know, right? So on a training or in supervision, the supervisor might say, well, you have to wait, you don't know, and so on. And but I like to say, Paul Simon has a song, there are 50 ways to leave your lover, right? Well, there are at least 50 ways not to know something. So we're very unsophisticated about not knowing, right? And so I think it should be part of every training to really study all the sorts of not knowing that exist in philosophy and theology throughout the years, so that therapists will be more at home with not knowing. So if you look at psychoanalysis, a lot of psychoanalysts, including Bion, use the idea from Keats, from the poet Keats, about just allowing things, and that particular way he expresses it made a sudden appearance in psychoanalytic literature in about 1967 or so, and then now it's being used by everybody as though that's the only way you can talk about not knowing, right? Whereas in fact, there's so many different ways. But I think it is interesting that Jung actually has many more ways of thinking about not knowing than most psychoanalysts do. So it's worth, I think, looking into Jung, the collected works, and trying to identify, how Jung is trying to manage ignorance, right? How do we, well, I like to say, it's the ignorance of the analyst that allows the patient to have a life, right? That if you can be ignorant in the right sort of way, that opens the space for the client. But if like Nicholas of Cusa, who Jung was interested in, he talked about learned ignorance, that you learn how to be ignorant, right? So a therapist, as they practice, the older they get, they should learn more and more how to be properly ignorant, so that their patients, their clients, can really speak freely, right? Without having being impeded by the ideas of the analyst.
Muito bom. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Lucy. Marta Chagas.
Oi, boa tarde. Primeiro, agradecer a palestra, que foi muito boa. E eu queria fazer uma pergunta, assim, mais da prática mesmo, né? Então, assim, como você falou, que a imaginação, né, como chave, né, para acessar o inconsciente. Assim, você pede para os seus clientes imaginarem, você os convida à imaginação. Quando você citou aqueles sonhos, né, que você achou assim muito interessantes, mas assim você conseguiu, não sei, você chamaria eles a imaginar, né, o que mais estaria nesse sonho, né? Quais outras expressões?
Yes, I understand. So that would be focusing on the content. I think David Miller, who from Syracuse University, he said, imagination is not a thing, it's a space, right? Imagination is the space where things can happen. So imagination is not an image or a feeling or a piece of art. It is the possibility for all those things. So I think the the analyst needs to have access to that space, that imaginative space, which is a space of possibility. So I think that my own feeling is that generally Jungians are too preoccupied with content, right? That the content's so fascinating. We could spend years looking at a snake and all the different kinds of snakes and all the things that snakes do and represent and all they've done throughout history. That's fine. But I think more important is for the client or patient to find in their own mind the capacity for imagination, not to find the meaning of contents, right? Because life is full of contents. There's, everything all around us, there's different stuff to look at and to think about and to do stuff with. But the thing is to find in one's own mind, in one's own life, a place from which to meet those things, from which to hear them, from which to listen to them, from which to think about them. And I think that's the big challenge for people in our society today, which is so complicated and so many demands. How do you find in yourself, a place in your mind, a place in your heart or your body where you can, which I would call the space of imagination, where you can allow these things to be. I don't know so much about this, but like in the Platonic ideas, there's the idea of chora, right, which is the original space. The space in which things can appear, things can happen. So I think the analytic space is a similar thing. It's like it is a space in which things can happen and things can appear, and the therapist, I think, is the guardian of that space, much more than being a guide to different processes. So I don't know if that makes sense.
Sim, respondeu sim. Fez sim. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada, Marta. A Mônica escreveu uma pergunta aqui no chat. Mônica, quer fazer a sua pergunta?
Eu acho que, na realidade, ele respondeu a minha pergunta na pergunta da Marta.
Ok, tá bom.
Então, acho que tô super satisfeita.
Tá ótimo.
Obrigada.
A pergunta é do Hugo Moraes.
Olá. Boa tarde. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de agradecer ao Thiago, né, e ao David. E a minha pergunta talvez seja um pouco redundante, até porque eu não conheço muito Deleuze, né? Mas pelo que você coloca aqui, né, parece que o Deleuze dá muita importância ao novo, né? E aí me vem em mente, né, essa relação do novo e o antigo, né, como símbolo da própria psicologia analítica, né? E aí eu gostaria de saber, né, se esse novo, no fundo, não se trata, assim, né, pensando até mesmo em comparação, assim, com a perspectiva mais platônica, né, não trata de um retorno também, né, de uma espécie de um eterno retorno, né, assim, pensando até mesmo nesse sonho que você trouxe sobre o peixe, né, que o paciente vê o pai dele, né, ali, né, dentro daquelas imagens, né. Então, eu gostaria de saber se esse novo, no fundo, não é uma nova configuração desse antigo, né, desse padrão antigo de comportamento.
Yes, I know people see it that way, right? But I don't find that way of approaching it very congenial. I think that is a way of thinking about archetypal images and archetypes, but that's not a very good way for a historical subject to get on with their life. A historical subject has to look to the future. They need to do what's required for their future. So even if, you know, there are things I'm interested in, there are things I want to do, and so on, that have a resonance with the past, right, with the archaic, and so on. In one way, I could say, well, so what? You know, I'm not an archaic man. I'm not the origin of all beings. I'm just me, David Henderson, in London, trying to live my life as best I can between now and when I die. So my main preoccupation is how to do that in an imaginative way, right? How to be alive in 2020 and be in the relationships I am and be doing the things I'm doing, how to do that in a way that is lively. So, you know, as Jung says, everything we do is in a context. So part of the context of being David Henderson is that I come from a family and from a culture and from a history, you know, that I'm part of different, you know, if you want to call it a civilization, I'm part of that. But those are the contexts. Those aren't my the point from which I can exercise my will or my imagination or make my decisions. So so the past is clearly there, but we have to move forward. You know, that the past is very important to me. I mean, for example, I have a great grandfather, right, who fought in the Civil War. He fought for a militia in Pennsylvania against the Confederacy, against the slavers and all that. So for me, that's very important, because I think, you know, Donald Trump is just a continuation of the Confederacy. So he's an enemy of my family, if you like. Donald Trump's an enemy of my family. So these are important things to me, but they're not a solution for my life, right? So when I mean a solution for my life, you know, like, what am I going to do tomorrow? What am I going to do the day after that? How am I going to speak to my partner? You know, all these things are much more immediate. And so I like what Deleuze is pointing to, where he says, allowing the difference to actively intervene. In other words, allowing ourselves to be disturbed by the demand of the present, by the demand of now. You know, we have the past to draw on and all of that. But I don't, I mean, like, for example, Jung says something somewhere, I think something like, you know, religion is about return to the original or something. I don't really buy that, you know. I think religion is about discovering, you know, meaning in history. You know, that we are part of history. So how do we engage in history? How do we, you know, at this moment, how do we engage with the pandemic? How do we engage with racism? How do we engage with, there's so much to engage with now. And how do we do that in a meaningful way? I had a little thought in the summer, which is, you know, I don't know how it is in Brazil, but in London, you know, there's a very strong influence of Kleinians, and the Kleinians are very interested in containment, right? So you need to have the proper containment so people can think and so on. And I was thinking, well, maybe the time for containment is finished. Right? What we need is to think about, how do we think psychoanalytically about action, right? How do we use the tools of psychoanalysis to decide, well, what is meaningful action? What is action that isn't delusional, right? Or isn't just a kind of repetition or something like that? Are there any tools in psychoanalysis? Are there any tools in analytical psychology to really help us think about making some new responses to things? So I'm happy for the past to be in the past, you know, but my preoccupation is today.
Thank you very much.
Obrigada, David. Obrigada, Hugo. Agora a gente volta para o Marcos, então, para as duas últimas perguntas, para a gente encerrar. Marcos, está aí?
David, queria fazer duas perguntas rápidas, mas de respostas difíceis, eu imagino. A primeira é, como você sente a receptividade da comunidade junguiana a essa aproximação do pensamento do Jung a filósofos da diferença ou a filósofos contemporâneos? Como é que você assiste a comunidade junguiana diante do teu trabalho? Segunda pergunta. Em 1970, Michel Foucault falou que um dia o século seria deleuziano. A gente pode pensar que um dia o século será junguiano?
Well, I think mostly Jungians don't know anything about Deleuze, and they mostly don't care. I mean, for example, it's amazing that, you know, the book on Deleuze and the unconscious, which is now like more than 20 years old, it hasn't been reviewed in any Jungian journal. I mean, I think that's amazing. I keep thinking somebody needs to do that, but I don't feel I know enough. I'm not expert enough to be able to review it properly. But it is a sign that there isn't a depth of.
Qual é o livro que você está se referindo, David?
Como? No, not Deleuze's, Kerslake, isn't it? Just a minute. Christian Kerslake, Deleuze and the Unconscious. Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, Christian Macmillan is probably the person who knows most about Deleuze and Jung. But I think at the moment he's not really working on that. He's doing other things. I mean, I do think Deleuze is the philosopher for Jung. You know, if you want a philosopher that helps you think about Jung, I think Deleuze is the one, you know, more than the other people who were brought out. But it isn't, it's very much at the beginnings, you know, of these things. It's not a developed field or a properly researched thing at the moment. I mean, I like Deleuze. I don't know enough about it. I need to read more. But it is, I don't know about, is Deleuze the 21st century Deleuzian, is the 21st century Jungian? I don't care, doesn't really matter to me. I really enjoy this discussion. It makes me think about things and read some more things, and I enjoy doing that. But what Jung means in the world or for the world or whatever, that I don't know, and I don't have anything interesting to say about that. I got my work to do, and how it all fits together in the big picture, I don't know. I don't have a kind of cathexis for Jung to be the thing for the 21st century. I don't have an investment in that.
Obrigado, David.
Ok, muito obrigado.
David.
Foi grande prazer.
David, muito obrigada pela sua vinda ao Tiaços. Marcos e eu agradecemos imensamente. Foi uma tarde de muitas perturbações que a gente vai levar para o fim de semana, e muito obrigada por isso. Muito obrigada pela sua disponibilidade, pela sua calma e pela sua tranquilidade em responder às nossas questões. Foi excelente mesmo. Fica à vontade se quiser falar alguma coisa para encerrar. Agora a gente vai terminando.
Well, thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your questions. Maybe one day I'll get to Brazil. Who knows? So I hope everybody stays safe as we get through this.
Você será nosso convidado, será um prazer te receber aqui no Brasil, David. Muito obrigada.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Gente, obrigada pela presença. Mais uma presença no Tiaços. Semana que vem a gente tem Jennifer, que vai falar do Gigerich, às 5 horas da tarde, certo, Marcos?
Certo.
É isso. Então, até lá, pessoal. Um beijo. Tchau, tchau.